So welcome everybody. This is just a short a round of cluster announcements. As usual, the meeting today will be recorded, but I guess most people are familiar with that right by now. Yeah, today we are very pleased and honored to have with us David Sumter from University of Uppsala, who will give his talk in a minute and will be introduced by Ian. Then later in the week, we will have a talk of the series Racism in Academia that is organized by the Zukunftskolleg. Very important and interesting topic, and therefore we would like to give you this information that you make sure you don't miss it. And then next week we have Manfred Hartbauer from University of Graz giving us a talk on alternative treatments of gregarious locusts. Which we expect will be also a very fascinating topic. Just in case you didn't know, the ZUCO will has a new call for fellowships for early career researchers from the Global South, and with a deadline in next February. And so if you know anybody from countries in Africa, Asia, or Latin America who might be interested in applying for one of these fellowships, please forward the information to them, as the clusters also engaged in this type of fellowship. And if people apply with an interest to be part of the cluster during their time of fellowship, we're very happy to integrate and accommodate them. So that was all from me for now. Enjoy today's talk, and I'm handing over to Ian now. Thank you.
Well, anyway, yes. So yeah, as Ina said, they say plenty of things about Dave, but he could equally say just as embarrassing things about me. So we've known each other for goodness, it's almost, I guess it's over 20 years. And the first time I met Dave was when he was a friend of my flatmate when I was a second year PhD student. And Derek, my flatmate, said, "Oh, you've got to stay in town this weekend because Crazy Dave's coming to town. It's going to be a big one." I do remember getting kicked out of a karaoke place at about 5 p.m. because Dave couldn't refrain himself from expletive-laden renditionings of sort of mid-90s indie music. Brilliant. And then I remember on the walk home, I asked Dave, "So Dave, what do you do?" He said, "Oh, I'm a PhD student studying social insects." "What do you do?" "Oh, I'm a PhD student studying social insects." And so we instantly connected there as well. And not only was Dave very influential throughout my PhD, introducing me really to mathematical biology for the first time, he also proved really central to me moving to Oxford subsequently. So he persuaded me to write a grant to apply to work with him and Steve Simpson in Oxford working on locusts. And both Dave and I were very lucky to get Royal Society research fellowships. And also when Steve Simpson, he'd been at Oxford for about 20 years, when he decided to move his lab to Sydney, Australia, Dave and I sort of inherited his space and the facilities and started our first collective behaviour lab, which we ran together. I'm just going to keep it short today. I mean, but you'll see from Dave's talk that his work has covered a huge range of collective systems, from the social insects that first sort of brought us together, to schooling fish and collective behaviour of humans, including team sports. So as well as being a professor of mathematics at the University of Uppsala, he's author of multiple books, including the textbook on collective animal behaviour. And he also applies his knowledge, as I'm sure we'll see, as a data scientist for the Swedish football team, Hammarby. So it's absolutely wonderful to have Crazy Dave come. I wish he could actually come to see our beautiful city, David, but I hope you'll come again with us. And I'm sure this will be an inspirational seminar. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction, Ian. It's very nice to hear. And I don't know what the silent introduction was as well, but I'd love to hear that one as well sometime. I'm feeling a bit emotional doing this. And also, I'm going to warn you that this is actually, because it's sort of, well, talking at Ian's group, it is a little bit of actually it's a very self-indulgent talk, this talk. So instead of telling you a lot about my most recent research things, I'm going to actually just talk about the last 20 years, probably since we left that pub at 5 o'clock in the morning in Bath. I'm going to talk about everything that I've done since then up to the current date. So it is very self-indulgent, but hopefully what I'm going to try and do anyway is give some kind of idea about the approach that I've taken trying to understand collective animal behavior as a mathematician and a data scientist and somebody working in modeling. What types of approach can you use to study these types of systems, and what type of approach specifically I've tried to use to approach them, and it's nice then that's sort of an excuse then to talk about a lot of the different systems and a lot of the different people that I've worked with along the way to study those systems. Okay, so the title, I changed my title a little bit because it's kind of like an overview, and what I'm going to talk about is how best to study collective behavior. I'm going to go through this in terms of 7 steps. And as I said, yes, it starts exactly, I think 96 must have been when we met at this pub in Bath. Actually, I was playing computer games with Derek, your friend, or our mutual friend the other night. So I'm still in contact with him. But I'm going to start there in 96, and I'm going to talk a little bit to start with about what collective behavior was like at the turn of millennium, what types of ideas were around then, and what the new ideas were, because I think that's important to understand the context of what happened later. Then I'm going to talk about how that research then led to using different types of collective behavior mathematical models to guide experiments. Then I'm going to talk about later, and this is very much something that Ian and other groups led, and we also did in our group, was this sort of machine learning revolution, how we use machine learning to understand collective behavior. Then I'm going to go off in a sort of rant about safe modeling versus what I'm going to talk about is more high-risk modeling. So I'm going to talk about things that I think are good. I'm going to try and give an idea about what I think is good modeling and what we can do better when it comes to modeling collective behavior. Then I'm going to talk about how similar things happen in the social sciences and football. I've written AI there, but I'm not going to actually touch on that. I'm going to talk about how the similar methods that we've used for understanding animal behavior can also be used in the social sciences and football. Because actually, for me personally, and that's interesting, going back to this thing in 96, I was never like totally fascinated by animals, to be absolutely honest. So animal behavior was something I worked on because I was interested in the idea about how we could scale up from individuals to groups. So, but then I got a little bit stuck with it and got really into it after a while. But I'm also interested in how you can use similar methods in social sciences and recently football. Then finally, there'll be some time for questions. I'll have some further digressions as I go off in a random direction, and maybe some more ranting that I've taken up from points 4 and 5. Yeah, this is, how did animal behavior and collective animal behavior look like in 1996? Well, there's a few very influential textbooks. I've taken out a copy here. This is Behavioral Ecology actually, this isn't the book that I was thinking of. This is, I've taken out the wrong book. I was wondering why it wasn't as dog-eared. This is a research review, but there was also a textbook in behavioral ecology, which Krebs and Davis had written. And a lot of that analysis was about costs and benefits of grouping. It was about time budgets. It was about comparative analyses and how you would understand groups. And a lot of it was framed in terms of game theory. So I also took out this book, which is Maynard Smith's book on game theory. And that was the main tool that people had for looking at group interactions in animals. There were certain games that you would describe as payoffs and so on, and there was a kind of evolutionary background to it. And it was very sort of stable view. You would do your experiment, you would find out about the optimal. It was always about something optimal. What do you find that was optimal about this species and about these individuals in these groups and so on? And for me, it wasn't very dynamic. It never really inspired me at all when I found out about this type of research. I came from a mathematics background, and I was much more interested in this idea about how individuals can interact with each other to create patterns. And there was two books that influenced me a lot. The first one, when I got my hands on this book, The Wisdom of the Hive by Tom Seeley, this I found extremely exciting because it described what went on inside social insect colonies, really in terms of kind of algorithms. And maybe, yeah, this is one of the classic algorithms that you see inside this book. And it's like how a honeybee forages and all the steps it goes through. And for me, having studied computer science, I thought that this was fascinating. You could actually describe animal behavior in terms of a kind of algorithmic description of how the animal worked and so on. And then, so this book was a kind of manual. I wrote in my notes that this is a sort of the manual of collective behavior, how you do an experimental study, but also how you think about modeling those types of systems. And then there was, of course, this brilliant book, which I'm sure many of you, or all of you, have probably seen before, Self-Organization in Biological Systems. And what was, everything is in here. I mean, I was amazed just looking through it this morning. I feel quite often I haven't properly cited this book because there is just so much stuff. There's things on ant trails, there's stuff on synchronization, there's stuff on aggregation, and just every kind of collective behavior is already described in this book. And what it really did and excited me as from my mathematical side is it said, well, you can actually describe these algorithms, and often the patterns that they create will be greater than the sum of the parts. There'll be these patterns that you really didn't predict. And where this, now to say where this book was lacking, I wanted to give this book a name because Guy Terrelaz, who is one of the authors on this book, when he put this book in my hand at the Newton Institute in 2001, and he called it the Bible. And he said, you know, this is the religious text upon which all collective animal behavior research will now be based. And I think it is sort of, to a degree, that type of text. But what it was lacking, actually, was really rigorous experimental work where these types of models were tested. And that's a lot of, well, it is a lot of what Ian's research has done, and also the research that I'm going to talk about now, was taking those theoretical ideas and testing them in different species, and also just refining those ideas as well, because since they hadn't really been tested experimentally, they really needed to be refined to make them more accurate. So here were some of the principles. There was lots of these things. There was phase transitions, rotating balls. This is something that Ian worked a lot on. It's written in the book, but came from that. There's rapid information transfer, decision-making algorithms, wisdom of crowds, fission-fusion groups, branching trail structures, leader-follower relationships, decision-making and bifurcations, quorum rules, social facilitation, synchronization. All of these ideas came either in the book or in articles which were written around that period in 1996 up to 2001. And what really needed to be done then was to investigate some of these using, well, do experiments to test these types of hypotheses and really refine them. And that brings us up to this period. And that's really a lot of what my research was about during that time, was trying to find out ways that we could test those mathematical models with different species. So I'm going to give a quick recap of those types of things, and just to give you a feeling for what I thought was important during those times. So one of the first things I did, it's also nice to, as I've said, to go through and go back and think about the people that I worked with on this. But one of the first studies I did of this type was with Madeleine Beekman. And she'd also read the Self-Organization book and related papers. And she was a very traditional behavioral ecologist, but she wanted to think, well, what can we test about these? And the idea we came up with was that we would look at a phase transition in the ants foraging. Because one of the key predictions in all of this sort of complex systems applied to animal behavior is that they will go through some sort of transition when they reach a critical mass. So we tested that with the ants by increasing the colony size and looking to see how successfully they went to a feeder. We also went on and did a hysteresis experiment to see if once we helped them form a trail to a feeder, they continue to do it. And then we could actually see there was this type of phase transition. There was this nonlinear switch to successful foraging when you had a critical density. And then that was very nice to show in the ants, and it's been shown in lots of other species since. And this is the article that Ian and I first worked on really seriously together. And we actually set up this experiment, although in the end it was actually Jerome who set it up properly. But we're using, this is Ian's old tracking tracking system, which would actually track the positions and the movements of the individual locus. And I think what was most amazing in this study was this switching behavior. When we had a kind of exactly at this critical density where you go over from disordered marching to ordered marching, you actually have this switching backwards and forwards. So this is also a hysteresis, but and I think this really blew our minds when we saw it, that we'd have these locusts would spend basically 2 hours walking around the ring in one direction. Then they would switch and walk around in the other direction. Then they would switch back and walk around in the other direction. And this is just something you would only predict from a mathematical model. It isn't something you would think naturally should happen. It was sort of, and I think this is a key of why you have these models, is that this stochastic fluctuations in the directions, suddenly they would kick over and then everything would reorder and go in the other direction. So this is a lovely example of a mathematical prediction which you could then later confirm in experimental work. And that also goes on to a whole range of stuff that we did looking at decision-making through bifurcations. Once you know that a system is going to switch between different states, you can think, well, how can animals actually use this to optimize their collection of food? And this is a series of papers that I've worked together with Audrey Dusseter and Stan Nikoulis, and also Natalia Zabzina. What we looked at was, for different species of ants, how these trails would form. And often we would make these kind of bifurcation plots, where this is an example where you only had one type of pheromone and they didn't go through a bifurcation or a strong bifurcation. When you have another type of pheromone, they have a very strong bifurcation. And when you use both pheromones, they're somewhere in between. And this is just one of those papers where we saw this type of phenomena. And we became very fascinated with this idea of being at the edge of these bifurcations, because if you're stuck near to these bifurcations, you can have a much more flexible foraging. So information, when you are next to a bifurcation, when you get information about new food, you can actually switch very quickly to going to another food. And in particular, we found that when you use multiple pheromones in food recruitment, you can do that switching much more efficiently. And this was something that was not just true for ants, but also true for fish. This is also work that Ian worked with, but is primarily experiments by Ashley Ward, which we used here. And here we were looking at, well, individual fish. And in this particular experiment, we're looking to see if they spot a predator. Individual fish end up swimming by predators and not being able to see it on random. But if you go in a group, then the group is better able to spot the predator. And that's because maybe one of the fish will see the predator, start to move in the direction away from it. The others will read its behavior and follow after it. This little one I always find funny because it goes in the wrong direction. But then I think it probably would have been eaten by the predator in reality. And what we could do is we could talk about quorum rules for this type of thing. So if maybe two individuals or more started to move in a particular direction, then the group would follow after it. And we were very successfully able to fit models which would predict the types of distributions we got in choice making between from one individual up to 8 individuals. The 8 individuals almost always making the correct decision. And then this was also work that I did in Oxford together with Lisa Collins. We could also look in other situations, and this is in farmed chicken houses. We could look at, well, how were they feeding? And what we found in this particular example was that the this is compared to a Poisson distribution, what was the feeding patterns for the chickens? And they tended to facilitate each other in the sense that they would go and feed at the same places. And this was part of a whole research program in animal welfare at Oxford, where a lot of emphasis had been put on density at which the animals were kept. And density wasn't one of the major problems for them. There was lots of problems with animal welfare, but density wasn't one of the major problems, because when they were at lower densities, they would go and find themselves at higher densities because they preferred to feed together. So that's another application of this type of thing. Then that's looking at facilitation. And then there was leadership, which of course you'll know Ian had done a lot of theoretical work on. And we did experiments looking at pigeon decisions. And again, we could use a mathematical model where we have this type of bifurcation, where you would have two pigeons flying on a route home together. And at some point, their preferred stereotypic routes would diverge. And at that point, they had to make a decision about what they were doing. And we found that they would go from a compromise up to about a sort of 400 or 500 meter divergence in their routes, to leadership when they had too big, leadership by one or the other when they had two big differences. And this was work by Dora Biro, who I also actually knew from around the same time as I met Ian, about 99 maybe. And in fact, we were also playing, I was playing computer games with Dora and Derek on Friday night. So that's quite nice, actually, thinking about that. So we've been friends for a long time and collaborated. And she did this experimental work and was able to show that. And we did things with larger groups as well afterwards. Then the same sort of idea of leadership. So this is leadership just in a group of two, but you have the same sort of idea of leadership in different situations. So this is, maybe you wouldn't really call it leadership, but this is a study we did of sheep-dog-sheep interactions. And Daniel Strombohm was able to show in a model that you could, if a dog made this kind of zigzagging motion behind a flock of sheep, it was able to drive a large flock of sheep in a particular direction it did. So first he formulated a model of how this shepherd, the sheepdog, would work. And then he tested that and compared it to data which Andrew King had collected with very accurate GPS devices, and showed that, again, and I think this was very much key to the whole leadership thing, that one individual or a small number of individuals could lead a group, a much larger group in particular ways. In this case, the leader is very different from the individuals, but the same type of principle applies. Then going back to what I said about Tom Seeley, we were interested in decision-making algorithms, and this is one of the things that consumed me for many hours and years, is a project I did together with Stephen Pratt and Eamon Mallon as well, looking at creating an agent-based model which described everything that ants did. We called it the traffic light diagram. So you've got red is stop. So when the ants found a new nest, they were moving to a new nest. When they found a new nest, they would first stop and assess the nest independently of all other ants, not paying attention to what they did. Then they would do something we called canvassing, which is sort of orange. They like the nest, but they're not entirely sure. So they would lead other ants to look at it by doing these tandem runs. I'm going to show one of them in the next video. And then green was go. They would start transporting and just carrying ants without really asking them if they wanted to be carried there or not. They would just carry them to the new nest site after a bit. And we were able to very accurately reproduce the whole process of which ants found new nests by creating agent-based models of all of the steps that they did. And that also allowed us to answer questions, and this was with Takao Sasaki later and Boris Granovsky, who did some of the modeling on this. We were able to test different things about whether crowds were wise or when individuals were better than crowds, because in this traffic light diagram, you've both got an individual assessment and you've got a group level decision, and you could find out when individuals or groups were better at solving various problems. Another thing that we looked at was branching structures. This is this is work done by, I've forgotten, Esther Miller. I've forgotten Esther's second name. Esther Miller also, she also worked on the locusts, but she also came and spent one summer in Sweden. And Kerry Hicks also spent a summer in Sweden measuring the structures created by wood ants. So we actually mapped out all of the wood ant trails in an area of the forest in Umeå where I was living, and could compare them both to Steiner trees, which uses the least trail, and direct links. And we found that they had a compromise between the two of them. Jerome Bull did a lot of the theoretical work on that. And that's something I've continued also with Tanya Latte did experiments on these ant nests for Argentine ants. And then Arianna Bottinelli looked also together with Tanya, looking at other ant species and how they connected up their nests in various situations. And we could show that they were using, very much like it had been described already in the self-organization book, they were building those types of branching nest structures, often optimal nest structures, but always nest structures, trail structures, but always self-organized trail structures. And then I haven't mentioned Teddy Herbert Reed or James Herbert Reed, who was involved with quite a lot of the projects I've already talked about. But one of the things we did, which I was really happy with as one of this kind of last experimental studies I did in collective animal behavior, was looking at these escape waves in fish. And he set up an experiment which would frighten the fish at one area, and then we could look at how the information passed through the group. And this was nice because this was something that had always confused me a little bit about how you can actually pass information through the entire group. So we knew about these stochastic flipping backwards and forwards, but what I'd never been very clear on was like, how can you actually get an entire group to go in the other direction? And so by fitting a model to this data, we could actually show that by creating a density wave, you could end up passing information through an entire group. And that might be an explanation of how very large fish schools in the sea manage to transfer information through the whole group. It becomes a dense area, which then passes the information and could turn away from a predator, for example. I've got a lot of text on this, so I think it's better if you look at me while I read it off and try and explain the different things. Because what I sort of wanted to do was, I do think that this was quite a successful research project overall. And I know that, well, you're all involved in a large collective behavior research program just now. And so I wanted to kind of give a little bit of an insight into what I think made what we did work quite well. And I think really it did start with, I always risk in overplaying this, but I've called it the Bible, so I've already overplayed it. So, I mean, it did start with this idea that we had this solid framework on which to build. And other people had written other papers, of course, but we had a sort of solid theoretical idea of this more than the sum of its parts. So there's a collective behavior, which was really nice. And that was a lot of the experimental work was based on that. And then what was also really rewarding in this particular thing, and also with what you're setting up now or doing in Constance, is a very multidisciplinary collaboration. There's lots of different groups involved. There's maths, there's physics, there's psychology, engineering, and of course there's biologists working on that. And I think to make that work, what I found is you need to have a really big diversity and acceptance of other people's ideas. So you need to have a diversity of backgrounds and a diversity of opinions and diversity of types of people. And you need to accept those other ideas. And one thing that Ian doesn't say in his introduction about me is that I'm all for this diversity of ideas, but I'm also one of the most arrogant people in terms of thinking that I'm right all the time. And that's kind of difficult. So I've tried to accept the diversity of other ideas, but I do tend to think I'm right. So what I think you need to do in a way, especially when you're leading a group like this, is you need to have these different ideas, but you also have always sort of demanded that there should be a common story about all of the articles we've written. So is a difficult thing to get right. but it's a very important part of doing this type of research. Throughout the time that we worked on this, I had quite a clear publication strategy. We had 2, maybe later 3 journals that I saw as the standard that we wrote for. So we wrote for, I really like this interface journal, the Royal Society Interface, and also Behavioral Ecology and Social Biology were 2 really, one more theoretical, one more experimental journals that we tried to focus on. But sometimes, of course, you'd have to respect people who had career goals, so you'd have to sort of go for bigger journals to try and help them get a job afterwards, which is one of the sort of unfortunate sides of these things. Then I found that optimal research groups tended to be in size of about 5 to 7 people with a mixture of backgrounds working on different things. Another thing I think is important, and this is where it's always been around, and Guy Terrelaz, de Neuburg, and you've got to have a healthy competition with other research groups, because it's nice when you sort of get that extra incentive that Ian's group is going to find out something and you want to sort of get the thing first. I think that that's a really important part of doing a successful research project. For me, on a personal point of view, I wrote a book which sort of unified what I was doing. I wrote quite a lot of review papers and tutorials, and that sort of helped give a clear image of who we were and what we were doing. As regards to travel, I did travel quite a lot, but I tended to travel to work with someone on something whenever I traveled somewhere. And then I've also said this thing at the end is because I think people of our generation were very lucky in the sense that it was easier then to get a permanent job. And so I was very privileged, both in my background and in the time that we were working. It was easier to have a more secure position and to make success in that type of way than it is now. Okay, so that's my sort of random things on secrets of success, which you can feel free to ask me about more later. And then we'll talk about, now moving on from this kind of collective individual behavior produce collective patterns thing. One thing that became very clear around, I think probably it's a bit earlier than 2012, it's probably about 2010. One thing that became clear is that the statistics we were doing weren't very good. And sorry, I shouldn't say we. The statistics I was doing in these types of articles weren't very good. I was just happy if I saw a collective pattern seem to match in the simulation what happened in the experiment, then it was like, yeah, that's really good. Let's write a paper, send it off, and we're very happy. And that was definitely a weakness in the type of approach that was happening at that time. And what the machine learning revolution did was say, well, wait a minute, there is actually tools for solving these types of problems, to doing the statistics properly and comparing different models to data. And not only that, is you can work with much larger data sets than we'd previously been working with. We were working with quite small data sets, a lot of hand-collected data, but now you could collect all the data you wanted by filming or otherwise tracking individuals. So there was a whole revolution in terms of what you could do with data. And that led to a different approach. And I'll give a few examples of this. Oh yeah, that was already started. One of the first studies I did with this was together with Andrea Perna, who filmed the movements of ants. So now we're sort of getting down to a much more detailed level. So we're looking at how an ant moves in respect to pheromone density. This is the density of pheromone around it. Its turning angle, how it respect to the density. And then we're trying to where it went next. And in this particular case, Andrea was able to work out that it follows something called Weber's law, where the density of the pheromone to the density to the right divided by pheromone gave a very good prediction of the turning. He was able to work out the turning angle and really get into the detailed analysis of how the ants moved. And he would do this for all of the ants and gradually work out this general rule. So again, we're using big data sets to work out these things. Then we did similar things for pigeons, looking at how they, this is really carrying on from the earlier work with Dora, with one of our PhD students, Benj Petit. And he looked in a very detail, also together with Andrea, at the interactions of the pigeons in various ways. What were the detailed cues that they used to decide when to turn left or right when they were homing together in groups? We did this became a, I don't know if this became a kind of massive project in our research group, which had various stages of elation and disappointment. I haven't mentioned Richard so much, but really he was very much leading the whole machine learning revolution that we did in our research group. And one of the systems we got into study, much to his despondence and also joy at various times, was what we called the prawns in a bucket experiment. And it was kind of, so prawns, these prawns weren't necessarily social in any way, but Ashley Ward found out that if you put them in a bucket, they would end up doing the same thing as the locusts did, and they would collectively start all going in the same direction, either clockwise or anti-clockwise. And this became stronger as you put more prawns into the bucket. So there was a phase transition. And what Richard did is he systematically controlled for all different possible models that you could have of the collective behavior of these prawns and worked out which of those models was most likely. The thing, I feel bad about telling this, but the thing was that it turned out, after all of this work, that Richard had only analyzed 1/60th of the data set, and he'd only analyzed one replicate, actually. And so he had to go back, he had to retract his paper, go back and republish it. Turned out the results weren't that different than if he had analyzed everything. So it's an amazing story in terms of his integrity. He was really despondent. He actually phoned me from Australia, where he was at the time, was really, really upset about this. But it's a great measure of his integrity that he went back and we redid everything from the start again with this model and got pretty much quite similar results that we got originally. And then the other big project, and this was again involving Teddy, James Herbert Reed, is we looked at various aspects of rules of motion of fish. Again, we had large data sets, we could fit neural networks, various models we used to fit and understand the types of interactions that the fish had with each other. And we found out, I mean, one thing that was really cool, and also Ian found this out and Guy Terrelaz found this out, that pretty much all of these models, the self-propelled particle models, they didn't really reflect what real fish were doing. There was a lot more variation in the speed than we'd assumed in the models. We got a rough idea. Really, there was a lot of fine-tuning out of those studies. And then at one stage, we did this experiment where we, now I've mixed these up, I have no idea which is which, to be honest, but what is shown here, and maybe you can, the video will be probably quite hacky over the Zoom, but what's shown here is 2 real fish schools and 2 simulated fish schools. And when we showed these fish schools on a test we did online, we found that people couldn't guess better than random which were the real fish schools and which were the simulated fish schools. We also did this experiment. This was lots of fun to do. We did it with computer people. We had a sort of mini conference, and Jens Kraus was there, who I mentioned earlier, who did lots of the fish work. And he's a really competitive person. And we set him, can you tell the difference between the simulated fish and the real fish? And Jens couldn't do it. He was one of the experts who got the 50-50 correct. And so he couldn't see the difference between a simulated fish and a real fish, despite all of his years of fish experience. The experts who could tell the difference were the ones who worked on the mathematical modeling, because they would see little flickery differences, which would reveal that this is a simulation. So that was quite nice to show that we got to the level where these models couldn't be distinguished from humans from experts. That's funny, this has come up a bit later. And then more recently, I was considering giving a more extensive talk about this more recent work, but I went for the sort of easier option of going for a review. But more recently, we've done a big project, mainly led by Nicholas Collins' group, also with Judith Mank, who's doing the genetics, and with the two Alexanders who've been doing the modeling work and the experimental work, looking at evolution of schooling. And Teddy's also, James Herbert Reed has also been heavily involved with this, looking at how, if we do selection over a number of generations, can we select for a more schooling guppy? And it turns out we could. We started with a guppy which didn't socially school very much. It was maybe just attracted to other individuals, but we ended up with a guppy that was very responsive to its neighbors in changing direction in response to them. It wasn't generally more active, it was a bit more active, but where it was most active was when it responded to its neighbor's position, and it would start to move in the same direction. And so that was a very long-term and interesting project where we could actually look at the evolution of schooling. Okay, so I said I'd try and give some general rules about what things worked. I think overall, the machine learning style of thing that we did, it really did sharpen our statistical approach. But this is maybe the one thing I want you to take away from this talk is that it was still humans who found the patterns and the models that we used. We were very attached to this modeling cycle where we'd start with a theory-driven explanation. So this was often a model that a human would come up with and explain how they thought that animals would interact. We do experiments on individual levels. Often these models would be completely wrong. We'd start to make new models and we'd look and observe global patterns and continue this kind of cycle round. But it wasn't the machines or the machine learning which generated the new models. It was rather the humans that generated the new models. And I have this is again, I feel I'm picking on Richard a lot, but this was again one analysis that Richard did where he announced that he'd done a PCA or something or an autoencoder, and he'd found this really strong signal in a 3D fish experiment we were analyzing. And it turned out after a lot of talking about this, that what the signal he'd found was that fish like to be at the bottom of a tank, which you could have sort of seen from the video quite immediately. And it's picking on Richard a lot, but it's kind of emblematic of a lot of those stories, or a lot of my feeling about machine learning things is that it's very useful for fitting models, but it's yet less useful for actually generating the models. You still need clever people to generate models in the first instance. And I think that becomes a real challenge because I've been looking a little bit about what you're trying to achieve at Constance. And I think it's brilliant because it's easy for me to say, you know, we had this idea of individuals to collective behavior, but now you have to do even more in order to make progress in this area. And I don't actually have any great solutions for what progress you can do, but I have a few small ideas. And this brings me to my digression rant on safe modeling. I'm going to go over time, but I'm actually going to have to leave out my digression rant on safe modeling. If you want a digression rant on safe modeling, you can ask me about that later, because I don't want to go over time. What I'm going to do instead of ranting about safe modeling, it's funny, I spent a long time thinking about this, but so I will, if you have questions, you can ask me about that. Because what I really want to do, I think I'd really rather use the time to give a positive message. And I think that when you do modeling, what you have to think, what's a good high risk model to try and do? And here I'm going back to Ian's work, and this is one of his first papers looking at different structures that you get from self-propelled particle models or these different interaction models. And what was really nice, I think, was that this pattern here of this torus movement of milling is just not something you'd expect from the rules. And also he made very nice predictions about hysteresis in this type of shape as you increase the orientation or decreased it again, what type of patterns you do. And I think that this is a really nice example of high risk modeling. And I always feel that we're not kind of finished there with the self-propelled particle modeling. This is work published more recently, though it's a few years ago now, from Daniel Strömbohm, and he worked on various models, attraction and alignment terms and so on. And one problem that we worked a lot on was, like, how do you create a model which both has a sort of stable mill and then suddenly goes to a moving group that moves in a different direction and then returns to a different shape? And so for the same set of parameters, how do you get lots and lots of different types of shapes? And I still feel that this is a problem that can be worked on more and understood in more detail. There probably is work looking at this that I'm not aware of, but it's something which I still think is a fundamental question and requires quite a lot of modeling work. And I would say that it falls into the category of good, maybe unsafe modeling, because you don't really know what you're going to get out of it. And Daniel found a whole kind of complex phase transition diagram with all different types of shapes he could get by just changing a couple of parameters in this model. Another thing we worked on a lot, this is work by Chi Ma, who I think has got the best, well, Natalia also had one of these guns, but this is taken from the same photo. She's got the best presentation photo here. But what she worked on was looking at, this was an ant foraging model, which we based around current reinforced random networks. And I haven't shown it in here, but we worked a lot on oscillators, because this is also a model of slime mold. And we worked together with Toshi Nakagaki's group on this. But if you have oscillators which are pumping things backwards and forwards, they can find more complex solutions to shortest path problems than if you don't have these types of oscillators. And we never really finished working on this and got completely to the basis of it. But there's a whole set of tools there which I think are interesting to try and find out how you solve those types of problems by using oscillators and by using current reinforced random walks. We did some experiments on ants and of course slime molds looking at this type of thing. Then I always think of this because I show this to my students when I'm teaching modeling complex systems for them. I think there's a whole range of things that we can actually go back to. So now I feel like a really kind of grumpy old man, actually. But there's a load of stuff that we can go back to from the 1980s, which I was very inspired by then, to do with cellular automata, which can be investigated further. For example, I only recently discovered this. I'd never really known about this thing called Langton's loop. Langton's loop is a self-replicating cellular automata. I've put a link there. You can go in, if you search on YouTube, you can find a Langton's loop. And what it does is it builds copies of itself. And you can think of this as actually the DNA inside this, maybe it's the RNA inside this loop. And it's the program which tells it how to build a new copy of itself. And it goes on building copies and copies of itself. And I also took, this is from another YouTube video, which I just love. If you look to the start there carefully, you'll see Conway's Game of Life being replicated. Based on very carefully selected initial conditions, you can get Conway's Game of Life to do this. This never ceases to amaze me. So we're now at an entirely different scale, and it's actually replicating itself on an entire new level. I just think this is one of the coolest things. So it's doing exactly what Conway's Game of Life does. And if you keep zooming up on that level, it will go to one more level of doing exactly the same thing. And that type of thing inspired something we've done recently, where we went back to some of these questions to do with the evolution of life. How can you make, we wanted to build a self-replicating system. We looked at various different lower level reactions up to producing something that's a self-replicating system. Now, Ernest, who developed this, I don't know why he used bananas, avocados and strawberries in his thing, but he replaced some chemical reactions with those things, and that was an illustration of how his thing worked. But if you actually replace the potato with formaldehyde, the banana with sorry, I can't do the chemical things. You can actually, I've actually published in chemical journals, which was really cool, but it's actually the same thing. And it turns out that model turns out to be the Formose reaction. And we tried playing around with different, very simple models which could actually build up higher level chemical reactions. And I feel there's still a lot of work that can be done of these types of models, which will allow us in the future to have new predictions about collective behavior. And I like to think of it, and I think it relates a lot to what we were trying to do when we were looking at the selection for social behavior in the schooling. It's a kind of 3-level emergence. You start with one level. In all of the problems to do with collective animal behavior, you're connecting individuals up to the group level. There's lots of questions to do with, well, inside individuals. So what's happening inside an individual's brain related to what the individual is doing all the way up to the collective level. And that's a really tough thing to do experimentally, but it's also worth trying to play around with these models in order to get some times about what's going to happen in there. All the things I've shown you now go a little bit in that direction, where you're not just trying to think about 1, 2, and 3 levels that you're modeling from one up to the other. As I said, I don't really know the answer to those things, but I do know that these are important questions. Similar issues, I'm going over time. Similar issues, segregation. This one I wanted to show to Ian because we found that the model of football, Barcelona, use a 3-zone model of football. They have an intervention zone, which is like a repulsion. They have a mutual help zone, which is like an alignment. And they have a cooperation zone, which is like an attraction or a kind of regulating distancing zone. It's all relative to the ball rather than to each other players, but it was really fascinating to find out that Barcelona basically used the 3-zone models of interaction. And we've been working together with data analyst Javier from Barcelona and Fran and Pablo here at Hammarby in order to develop that model. Sorry, you can also ask me more about football later and how we use that. But I think with that, I want to say thank you and allow you some time to ask me questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
David, I have a comment.
Oh no, you're there, Jens.
Yeah.
So what are you doing here? Go away.
First of all, I want to thank great talk, and also for making me the poster boy for failing at the Turing test. And I just wanted to add that, of course, I only failed because Ashley Waters heckling me throughout the entire time.
Yeah, but Jens, you also, I think that you, according to Ian anyway, you heckle a lot of people while they try to do all the challenges they come up with. So I think it was fair. I just remember you sitting there later afterwards, like still wanting to play it and saying, how do you crack it? And you were asking people, you know, how do you do it? So I didn't know you were there though. That's embarrassing, me slagging you off. And you
Also, would you be willing to briefly go into the safe modeling thing that?
Yeah, that's a safe question, isn't it? So let me just say something about that, because it's weird. I spend a lot of time thinking about this. So since this has come up a lot, my thinking about this has come up a lot when I moved from writing more pop, I started writing Socomatics and Outnumbered. I started to think about, like, you know, often when you've got to communicate to a wider public, you've got to like say things which are concrete and really explain how you've learned something about the world. And so a lot of the examples I've given today have that nature, that they are something solid about the world. And I think in my experience, and I'm not going to, well, I am sort of naming names in this thing. I've always had a problem when I'm at conferences and somebody is talking about how they have a machine learning approach to, which normally means that they're sort of saying that they're going to let the data tell them something, as if the machine or the AI has taught them something, when actually they've assumed that there really is a model. And the machine learning approach, machine learning is statistics, right? And it's a good way of doing statistics, but it's nothing more than that. You always need that creativity that I got into a bit later on when you're doing those types of things. Another thing I'm skeptical of is there's a lot of discussion about an analytically tractable thing. And this is a thing mathematicians do a lot, is they say, well, you've got your model, but I'm going to do an analytically tractable model. And that can simplify things a little bit, but it doesn't tend to give the big insights that you see in books like Self-Organization, or you see in a lot of the modeling papers that came out of Collective Behaviour. And it's the same thing about, and this is also something that Ian and Jens will know all about, is these years of like fighting over if it was a first order or second order phase transition in particle models. And physicists do this as well. In fact, maybe physicists are the worst at it, is that they come in and they invent the whole field of collective behavior over and over again by using some statistical mechanics model they've got, which is very difficult to understand what it really tells you. But then when you finally go in and you get all the details out, it turns out not to really tell you things. And then this is probably the one that I think is the worst. And I've certainly written things about the evolution of cooperation. But for me, the whole kind of, and now I do have to name names, the whole kind of Martin Novak project of trying to like find out different rules of cooperation, that was just a total waste of time, because it didn't focus on the mechanisms. He kind of said, oh, I'm going to focus on the mechanisms as in some sort of graph or something. But those graphs didn't correspond to any of the things we were studying. And so that I found very frustrating. But I also have to say, I also found it very frustrating, and that there was a sort of vacuous debate about this, that, oh no, it was Hamilton who found this out first. I mean, both of them were just talking about very general rules for cooperation. And I think that you need to focus on the details. So if I was going to give some, now I've said everything that I wanted to say about that, because I think if I was going to give some advice for younger people who are modeling things, this is less for the biologists, but more for the modelers, is just don't get stuck in that sort of illusion of theoretical sophistication when you're using these models, and think instead about what kind of new ideas you can generate from the models that will be testable in experiments.
Dave, I have a question which is addressed, I mean, to you obviously, but in a way to the community as well. I mean, collective behavior is just a tiny aspect of social behavior. And in the last 20, 30 years, we have very successfully addressed this little spectrum of social behavior that can be modeled when we use attraction and repulsion and these kind of forces. But I think, to me, it often seems like we have stagnated in many ways, because we haven't really addressed richer types of social interactions than these. And I just wanted to get your perspective on this, you know, why we have so long stayed with these very simple principles, and we are not addressing a lot of the social behavior that I think many biologists are actually interested in. Which is not saying that it isn't wonderful what has been accomplished. Obviously, I'm part of this community, but I wonder why we have stayed with these very simple rules for so long.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what I'm trying to say. I think it's very nice of you to set it up in that way, because I think that there's one of the problems is we get caught in safe modeling. So you'll have a model which is really sort of paradigm changing, like Ian's self-propelled particle model and the ball going round and round and so on. That you know, that's paradigm changing, and then people start to do experiments to work on it, and they find things out, and that's very nice. But then the modeling people, they shouldn't just stick around and think, well, you know, let's model more aspects of these different self-propelled particle models. They should think, you know, what's the next stage? What's the next crazy thing that we could come up with? And that's what I'm trying to get at with these going back to some of these cellular automata things. A lot of the stuff that came out around that time from the Santa Fe Institute, it was a load of sort of crazy mathematical ideas, which then it took a lot of time to process through them and generate things from. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at. We need to do more from a modeling perspective. We need to have a few more of those types of crazy things going on, which then biologists like yourself and others can start to boil down and use in experimental ways. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, I think, actually, is that there is a lot of scope for using the types of skills that we have in other systems. And that's what I found started when I started working in football and talking to the Barcelona coaches and finding out that they use these zonal models, for example. There's definitely possibilities for using these applications in different areas. It was also, we did a big study of segregation in Sweden and using the Schelling model and testing this at different levels at classrooms and so on. So there's also a scope for applying these methods in other systems too. But I think the big thing for me in collective behavior should be a bit more fanciful modeling, open to just sort of spend some time just simulating stuff and seeing what types of patterns come out.
If I may comment on that as well. So I totally agree with you, Jens. You know, if I see yet another paper on self-propelled particle modeling, it just drives me crazy. And as Dave said, it's almost with physicists these days, you know, just producing yet another model of that type. And that's, I think, really what we're trying to do in Constance is moving away from that paradigm, moving towards the fact that organisms are cognitive entities that make decisions explicitly based on sensory information. They're under selection pressure. They live in complex natural environments. And so we need to use, you know, with people like Lucy Atlin looking at the emergence of culture in animals, you know, and you know, the connections between the animal work and the human work is really profound and important. But you know, what's really been missing from collective behavior is thinking about cognition, thinking about the fact that organisms are not self-propelled particles. And so I think we need to address much more sophisticated, much more interesting questions. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do with our community, is to move away from these this type of narrow view of what collective behavior is, and realizing that, you know, counter to what you're saying, Jens, it's actually fundamental to all aspects of social behavior. So I think we can contribute a lot, but we have to completely change our way of thinking and our way of working.
Which of the systems you would like to study but haven't found methods or technology to study them? Wow, that's an interesting question. I don't think that that's a limitation. So to be honest, when I've chosen what I've studied on during the time I've worked on it, it's just basically been down to the problems that have been given to me by people like Jens, for example. So like I remember when James Herbert Reed, Teddy, turned up in Uppsala, he asked us, like, what are the big questions in collective behavior now? What should we be looking at? And like Richard and I were like, well, we don't know. You're meant to come with them. And we never really had a sort of method for generating big questions. What we did instead is we looked at the experimental data that people had collected. So I've always worked from that perspective, actually, that people, and now that's the same in football, or it's the same in social sciences, that people actually tell me about a project that they're working on, they've collected data for, and then we try and find ways to study it. So to be absolutely honest, there isn't really a system I could identify in that way. It's always about somebody bringing kind of the methods and the technology, they found out something new, and what can we add to that from modeling, for example. Okay, I wonder what you mean by saying that you come down on the side of bottom-up models. Are you saying that principles that apply to larger emergent properties cannot be? Okay, so no, I think I'm coming down. I think I am on the side of bottom-up models, in the sense that, are you saying that principles that apply to larger emergent properties cannot be extrapolated to the, right, okay. To the particle level. I mean, I suppose one thing, one thing I'm thinking about is that when I'm talking about these three levels, I suppose, one thing I'm thinking about there is exactly as Ian was referring to there, is that you have some model of cognitive interactions, then that predicts things about the individual, and then you have some model of the individual interactions which produce things around the collective. So I think what I'm really calling for is going to a much more bottom-up level, rather than looking at these kind of just statistical models of properties of various things. So I feel that a lot of our modeling should be around writing down how things interact with each other and what type of collective patterns they generate. And I feel there's actually a lot more that can be done there on a very fundamental level than is currently done. I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question. Tatiana says, thanks for a great talk, that's nice. How would you compare the models you mentioned with those used in systems and synthetic biology? Exactly, no, that's really nice. So I love those types of models. And if you think about the ant algorithm thing where the ants were choosing between two nests, there we were trying to use a synthetic biology style model where we write out exactly what happens in systems biology. I think that's really important. But what we were trying to do in the project I mentioned with Ernest there, where Ernest had these fruit reactions, is a different thing, and it goes back to the bottom-up idea. So instead of saying, here are the chemical reactions we've got, what type of things come out of them, we say, let's try and set up chemical reactions which self-replicate, for example. And so that ties into that type of, but it's a kind of more scenario type of modeling. Later, when you've got that type of modeling and that type of output, then later, yes, it becomes a sort of synthetic biology that you do. And actually, Ernest, who did that study, he went off to work on experiments where they were doing these basic building blocks of life things. Wow, somebody's going to ask me what I wrote in 2006. Okay, in 2006, biology has become a field of super efficient stamp collectors, and that the vision for the future was unchanged in several decades prior to when you wrote the DS. No, I don't think so. I think actually it's really really changed. I think there was two aspects of biology then. When I wrote that in 2006, I was probably thinking about the situation in 2000. There was two aspects. There was people who were just doing these kind of like, this is how the animals live type of studies. And then there was ones using time, efficiency, energy to try and work out things about animals, like Davis. And I think that that's really has changed. People are all thinking about mechanisms for this thing. And yeah, I mean, 15 years later, you'd never have imagined that you're all sitting in a massive center to study these types of things. And there is a lot less of that stamp collectors, and there's a lot more ideas of how things are interacting with each other and how things are working. So of course we can do more in the future, as Jens says, but I think that things have really moved on since 2006. Yeah, how do you see the new technologies? I mean, yeah, it's really exciting, isn't it? To be honest, I mean, you know, to be honest, I'm not really working in collective animal behavior anymore. So I see now and again the amazing technologies that are coming about. And I do think about how they can be used. And we've done some stuff on 3D tracking, for example. We recently, one of the last papers I wrote in collective animal behavior was about exactly this thing, when you have a predator attacking prey in 3D. So yes, you can do really exciting things in that way. Whether that particular one, whether the 3D one will change things, I'm not entirely sure, because I think it's probably the sort of similar methods we have in 2D. Where I think the biggest changes come is when you're, again, I'm just going to say this thing about 3 levels, where you're looking at how neurons are determining individuals, determining group behavior. There are so many challenges, both in trying to formulate a framework to work with those problems and how to use the experimental data around those problems.
A quick question on, I guess, one thing that strikes me is that, you know, when we make a model, we try to make a model to be quite general, to explain general patterns. But actually, we think about the collective, like Ian's self-propelled particle models, they're really focused with movement. And I was wondering, but actually what strikes me with your on the football teams and so on is that you're actually applying some of these principles to, for example, how to win at a football game. And I was wondering if you could talk about your impressions in generalizing the sort of insights that you've gained from these simple models to other types of actions that groups have to solve.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I really, again, I got so obsessed with going over some of the old stuff I've done in collective behavior, I didn't get to say much about the football, which I'm sure a few people will be annoyed at. So one thing that's you immediately see when you start the great thing about studying football is you get to talk to the players about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And that makes it really easy to get insight into, you can actually find their rules of motion by asking them what their rules of motion are, what type of behavior they do. And then you can see that they're doing it in training, for example, over repeated situations. So that's really the way that you can find out extra things. The thing is that even in studying a football match, there's so many different situations. There's maybe, what would I say, there's a sort of somewhere between sort of 50 and 100 different types of collective behavior to observe in a football match. And then you see exactly this idea of context being really important. Talk about for attacking, passing football are very different than models we talk about for taking a corner or for taking a penalty even. There's like so many different models. And then you realize just how difficult it is to deal with complex systems, because there's a new model for every one of these different activities that they deal with. I mean, we work, I can just show if, right, do seem to be a few people left. So, but if I just show a few of the types of things that we calculate. So we calculate, this is something that we call, this is something which we call pitch control. And in this particular situation, this is the women's team and we're the green team. And what we're trying to do is we've said that we want to control, we don't want to have this situation where we have one defender here and one of their attackers. One of these two players should be back here. And we use this model to say who's going to get to the ball first. The ball is here, but if the ball is randomly dropped down at a particular place, who's going to get to the ball first? And this is one model that we use for defensive, and we've actually developed, together with the trainers, we've developed a system for defending, which is based on pitch control, so based on the mathematical model, which is really nice. But then here's a totally different situation. This is with the men's team, and this is an attacking pass. This is a question of who should you pass to? And there we calculate pass probabilities, probability of success using a mechanistic physics-based model. What is the probability that he can make a successful pass through ball to this player or a successful pass to there? And you see that there's a higher probability of making this pass than there is in making this. Of course, this is a more dangerous pass. So we have another model again for looking at the impact of those passes. So it's really, when you're studying football, you really get the idea that it's like lots and lots of different models all put together and used in different situations. I'll answer your question. I'm not sure it was really.
I guess I was curious about, how much we can generalize some of these models to different types of behavior. So what you're saying is actually often each behavior probably needs its own model. I guess I was curious if you think that there are some more generally unifying rules.
No, I think I'm against unifying things. I think that's my complaint about the game theory thing as well. Or any of those things that I said was like safe modeling. They tend to be down to the idea that you can unify things. I mean, you can unify approaches. So you can I have I have an approach to football, which is in some sense unified, that there's these sort of tools that you can use for understanding different aspects of football, but there's no like single model that you can use in different situations. And I think that's really what I found across all of these research things is like, oh, somebody writes a paper with some useful model, you can take it in and you can use it and try and solve that problem, but that doesn't mean you're going to be able to solve another problem with it. I'm not sure if that's the way you mean unified, because I sometimes use the word unified as well, but I try and stay away from the idea that there's like one theory or one overarching principle that you can use in all situations. It's more that you have a kind of one type of approach and then you try and fit in the right model to those types of things. I've always think it's fascinating because I feel I've lived through all of these like unified approaches. So when we started, it was all about game theory. Then there was like this massive networks thing. Sorry, Damien. And then there was like, then there was, oh, it's all machine learning or whatever. And I don't actually know what it is that you're all talking about now. But that's those types of like, oh, it should be all this type of thing. And often the mathematical ideas underlying each of those things are the same as you can find in some textbook that Robert May wrote in 1970 or something. So it's not really, I think actually chaos theory is probably going to make a comeback in the next few years. That's my prediction for the future, because nobody's been talking about that for a while.